Hi guys, we're here with another episode of Jewish Agnostics. Here we're
And
doing a
what's
book
interesting
review.
about this episode,
Yeah, sorry, go on us.
yeah, what's interesting about this episode is that this is actually our first book review on the channel, on the podcast. So here we have Oren Schneider, and Oren, if you could maybe introduce yourself a little bit.
Hi, Oz. Hi, Stephen. I'm so happy and honored to be your first book review. Congratulations. My name is Oren Schneider. I live in Brooklyn. I'm Israeli, lived in Israel most of my life, moved here about 18 years ago. I'm an entrepreneur and business owner. Um, Live with my family in Fort Greene and am publishing my first book this week, The Apprentice of Buchenwald, that's dedicated to my late grandfather, Alexander Ruziak, or the way he was named at birth, Alexander Rosenberg.
So the book will provide the link in bio. I know it might be reversed on this camera, but it's The Apprentice of Buchenwald, the true story of the teenage boy who sabotaged Hitler's war machine. It's a mouthful of a title, but it's also a mindful of a book. And I really thought it was very interesting. So let's dive into the first question. Who are you outside of this book?
So I'm definitely not a writer, right? That's my first book. After my second book, I may consider that title. I'm an entrepreneur. I never thought I'm going to write a book or publish a book. Growing up with my grandfather, who raised me like a father since a very, very young age, I was exposed to our family story, to his personal history, to his adventures, if we can call them that, during World War II. And I always knew that I'm going to tell the world his story. I did not know that I'll need a global pandemic to enable me to do that. But life is funny that way. So I'm enjoying this new path of writing and telling a story. And I'm looking forward to continuing that path.
Very interesting answer. So on to our second question. So what made this book very interesting compared to other books that dealt with similar topics is that the fact that you chose to write it in the first person, even though it was not you that experienced it, but your grandpa, which I thought was brilliant, by the way. But, like a lot of similar books, they didn't do that. They always write about the events that unfolded in third person. So we'd just like to ask, what led to that choice? What led to that decision?
What a great question. I mean, I came to the process of telling the story without any baggage. It's not that I've written books before. I've read a lot of Holocaust and survival books before. And this story was very personal to me. I knew it really well. I traveled to my grandfather's homeland of Czechoslovakia, then Slovakia today. Traveled with him through his path that led him to the concentration camp in Germany, Buchenwald. And I felt as if I was there. I felt that his story would touch more people if it was told in a more intimate, personal type of way. And when COVID hit and I had to shut down my business and sort of figure out what I'm going to do in these spring months of 2020, and I did some seminars in writing and built some of my tools, it became very clear to me that first, I'm going to write it in English, which is not my first language. My first language is Hebrew. And second, that I'm going to tell the story as if my grandfather told the story. And my daughter, who's a teenager, who's American, was extremely helpful in actually giving great advice on how a book that an American would write would sound like, and she's extremely instrumental in putting it together. So it was teamwork, and I really enjoyed that path.
Okay, yeah. I think it's a really good
That
explanation.
sounds
I also felt way more connected to the book. Although I do know as your grandfather, it's just like you using like personal pronouns just made you feel attached to him rather than kind of distant and kind of observant. You felt there.
Yeah, like you're experiencing it yourself. It's a powerful way to really relive this terrible time of history. So it
Yeah, and when
was
I
a
wrote the
genius move.
words, I heard in my head him telling me. I've been recording him since childhood, and I have many, many hours of those recordings. And it really felt as if he was the person telling his own story. He was there, even though he wasn't. So it felt very, very natural to me.
Uh-huh. Moving on to the third question. Do you think you infused some of your entrepreneurial mindset as a business owner into Alexander throughout the book? Because as you can see, and we'll review later in the book, he is very entrepreneurial, and that also actually allowed him to survive. In addition to an entrepreneurial mindset, did you infuse anything else of your own into the book?
I think if anything, it was the other way around. So Alex has been extremely entrepreneurial. So he was a very affluent child, growing up to a pampering family in Slovakia in the 1920s. Obviously, I'm not going to give away the story. I'm happy and curious to hear other people's thoughts after reading it. But he basically lost everything. They basically lost everything and had to start from scratch. And growing up in his father's mercantile business, he saw and learned the ways of the trade. He saw and learned the skill of managing a business, of managing finances, of being independent, of being responsible for your own decisions, and taking the lead in your own life. He obviously implemented all of that throughout his terrible adventures, being captured, deported, placed in a concentration camp, in a forced labor camp, um, ultimately leading to his survival, to his father's survival. So he became the quintessential entrepreneur in times of war, and he brought those talents when after he was liberated, when he embarked on his journey with his new wife, right after the war, going to Israel to fight the independence war in 1949 and opening and starting his own business or businesses in Israel. So he was always the entrepreneur. He never had a boss his entire life since the age that he was an apprentice before the war. And again, it's all in the book. And obviously, raising me, I saw him. I went to his office after school. I sat on his lap when he was writing teleprinters and telex messages and all those machines and devices that are no longer with us, and most young people wouldn't even know what they were. But I was there when he was building his businesses, and I mean, I inhaled and breathed and basically learned everything I know today from him. So it's really his entrepreneurial spirit and skill that gave me the confidence to do what I'm doing today.
Sounds like he was a great and truly influential role model for success. It's great to hear that. And now we're going
By
to
the way,
be.
let me just add, he was more than anything, he was an optimist. And if I had to advise people that want to consider an entrepreneurial lifestyle or future, I would first ask them if they're optimistic, if they view life with a rosy lens, because that is a
That's wonderful.
foundational requirement for anyone who wants to start a business, who wants to change the world, who wants to develop an idea and take it to market. You have to, otherwise it doesn't work. And I think that being that optimist allowed my grandfather to successfully navigate through the terrible challenges that life brought upon him at a very, very young age, and then also later in life. But that was what he was, an optimist.
Yeah, I think that's really cool.
It's like, yeah, even keeping that inner light alive, even such a terrible time. And speaking of, that inner light, so a lot of people derive that from religion. So I guess the question here is, um, how did Alexander's belief in God shift after the Holocaust? And, consequentially, did your view shift after hearing his stories?
Um, so Alexander was a great grandson of a very famous rabbi. And again, I'm not going to spoil too much of the book, but he originated from a very orthodox, ultra-conservative family. However, like in many Jewish families in that era, in those generations, some kids went to school and other kids went to work, and basically supported the ones that went to school. And his grandfather, who was the oldest brother in a very large family, became the trader and opened a business that was extremely secular, that offered some of the most pampering luxury goods to the elite of the region. And the family became extremely secular. So they went to shul, they went to synagogue and the high holidays, and they were big supporters and contributors to the Jewish community, but they were not Orthodox. Um, I mean, based on his testimony, on what he told us about life at home, they were not religious, and I suspect that they didn't believe in God. But they respected the community and they respected their Jewish heritage and legacy. And they were probably deep in the closet atheists. But that, I mean, no one spoke of that at that period. And when the Nazis took over Czechoslovakia, and when their supporters, their local supporters, started chasing Jews, confiscating their property, they didn't really care if the Jew was Orthodox or Orthodox light or secular or atheists. If they were Jews, they were prosecuted, they were deported, and they were murdered. So the fact whether you were Orthodox visually or not visually, or if you weren't, didn't really make a difference. Like it really doesn't make a difference today. So everyone shared the same terrible fate back in those days, and they were one of the few families that survived in their town. Their town had 3,000 inhabitants before the war. About a third of them were Jews. Probably more than 95% of that Jewish community perished in the death camps in Poland. And there was really very little in common between the ones who survived. Some of them were Orthodox and some were secular, some were rich and some were poor, some were educated. There was a terrible element of randomness to an outcome during those days. You needed to be in the right place in the right time. There's a unique story behind Alexander and his family and their survival, but other people survived in different circumstances and because they did different things or they were in the right place at the right time. Um, so I think that that alone had little influence on how he saw his religion. I think that the camp experience was extremely impactful in that sense because he saw the difference between Jews who fought for survival versus Jews who prayed for survival. And there you saw a distinctly different outcome. And really the people who took the initiative and help themselves. And he used to constantly comment on that, saying something like, if you help yourself, God is going to help you. And again, this is more metaphorically, not that he believed in the specific existence of a God or an all-knowing or a all-controlling God. It was more about the fact that he truly believed in the individual's ability to influence his or her own destiny. And he himself never believed in God, but he really respected his heritage, his legacy, his community, and he was Jewish, but he was. I mean, he had his own interpretation of what it meant to be Jewish, and it was really about loving thy brother and loving thy sister, and that's what he sort of taught us as his family, as his grandchildren, and we're continuing the
Would you
same
say
path.
like would you say like his overall belief on religion didn't really change throughout his experiences on the Holocaust? Like he maintained that level of respect he'd always had, even though he hadn't necessarily been devout or necessarily even believed in it.
Yes, I think if anything, it reinforced his belief in supporting his community, but first and foremost in an individual's own responsibility for his own actions and his own and their own faith. And he basically lived that way his entire life and taught us to live that way.
Uh-huh.
Even tying to just the question right before, you can already see that entrepreneurial spirit flowing through him just through those ideas alone. And so, just while we're on the topic of difficulties and overcoming them, what difficulties did you encounter when writing this novel, and how did you overcome them?
Um, wow, what a great question. You're bringing me back to 2020. Um, so when COVID hit, I didn't know what I was going to do. My business was crashing down, and I had to deal with dozens of employees, with banks, with lenders, and with many people who were not sure where the world was heading. Uh, I definitely increased my alcohol consumption during those weeks and months. So a lot of bourbon, a lot of scotch. But very, very quickly, I understood that I had to make that terrible, terrible time count. And very quickly, I knew that this was my time and that the universe was signaling to me that um, I've wasted enough time, and I had to attend to one of the reasons that I'm here, and that is to tell my grandfather's story. So the first challenge was how do you actually write a book? Um, I always enjoyed writing, but I never did that in a serious way. So I asked friends what I should do, and they basically advised me to take lessons and build my expertise and understanding of writing techniques. And I did that very intensely over a number of weeks, where I forced myself to write every day and learn every day and be critiqued every day by as many people as possible, until I got to a place where I felt confident that I had mastered at least a basic level of an ability to tell a story. Um, then my other challenge was what language do I write it in? Obviously, I still sort of think and dream in Hebrew, but I live here in the States, and I thought that my target audience would first and foremost be an American audience, where I felt people could benefit from hearing more stories and more relatable stories that are delivered and packaged in a way that's accessible and
Had you written
easier
in Hebrew,
and
I wouldn't be able to read it.
yeah, and easy to comprehend, because my experience as a young child or a teenager, because in Israel we're being fed the Holocaust institutionally, and everyone lives it from a very, very young age. But let's put that aside. I felt that the books that were available, many of them were not really accessible. They were heavy. They were difficult reading. Which I personally find it difficult to connect with. And I thought that telling a story that's sort of very accessible, easier for people to connect with, easier to see them as the family that we're talking about, as the hero of the story, I thought that that would be the right approach. Um, so I took it upon myself to sit down and write in a foreign language, which I enjoyed a lot. Um, and then came the next challenge, which was I knew nothing about publishing a book or taking a manuscript to market. So I had to learn about this new industry called book publishing, which was interesting. Again, as an entrepreneur, being introduced to an industry whose business model doesn't really work anymore, especially not for authors or for people that want to make a living out of writing. So very quickly it became apparent that you can't make money out of writing. If you're really successful, you could pay back your expenses. And again, that was never the goal behind this book, but it was a really intriguing and eye-opening for me to learn about this industry. Um, so it was a great experience all around. It's filled with challenges and overcoming them. And I must say that what really opened the gates for this book to come to market is the day I got to know Miss Lisbeth Hank from Amsterdam, who made it her life quest to help second generation and third generation Holocaust storytellers to take their stories to market. And she was amazing. She helped me catch up on the missing elements and voids in my understanding of the process. And she took me by the hand. She loved the story, she loved the book, and she took it all the way to market. And this book is really all thanks to her.
Wow, that's really cool.
Yeah, I like the fact that it was written in English because, being Jews ourselves, we're also surrounded by stories of the
Wait, you're
Holocaust.
Jewish?
The wider American audience, I mean, heck, I think I even read a statistic that 1 in 10 millennials don't even believe in the Holocaust or don't even know anything about it. So it's very important what you're doing, just being able to spread that message out there.
I totally agree. It's a responsibility that that we carry as, being the generations, second, third, fourth generation to the survivors. Now that most of the survivors are no longer with us, it is our responsibility to make sure that these stories remain alive and relevant and accessible. We were there in many ways, like the survivors themselves. We lived with them their entire lives. We absorbed those stories. We went back to them to visit the camps. It is definitely my personal responsibility in my lifetime to make sure that as many people are exposed to those stories and are aware, and not because there's something extremely special about the Jewish faith. There's a lot of genocides and there's a lot of wrongs that are of immense proportion that are happening in Africa and in Asia and in many other places. And I think that it is the survivors and their families' responsibility to make the world aware, mainly because we want to make sure that these things don't happen again, or when they happen, that people feel that they're responsible and feel that they have a role to help people avoid these terrible fates, and they have a role to help and support, like the world is gearing to support the Ukraine, like the world is helping other
Yeah.
difficult humanitarian situations. It's our responsibility, being citizens of the world.
And I think, even on top of that, even just writing it in English, although it's a Holocaust book and that allows to educate so many, it also speaks as a genocide book that can help be applied to basically, the ones you were saying, African genocide, the Rwandan genocide, the Asian genocide, the Uyghur genocide, and so forth. And just the realization of the prevalence of genocide allows you to stop that, not only for Jews, but for the world.
Absolutely. It was also really important to me that the book would be accessible for younger readers. So when I say younger, I don't mean like lower school, middle school, but definitely high school. This book is definitely sort of aimed at high school students, and sort of my daughter was that case study. It's purposely filtered in a way that allows people to not be traumatized by reading it. There are definitely more difficult pieces in the book itself, but they're very realistic, and it's purposely not going into really, really difficult places. But people can imagine and people could see those difficult places without it being too visual or too in your face, if you know what I mean.
Yeah, I actually do know what you mean. And I remember when I read my first Holocaust book in fourth grade, it was I honestly, one of my friends, my brother had read it, and as the younger sibling of 8 years, you have to do everything your older siblings do. So I was let me read it, and I read it, and it was definitely one of the more gruesome ones, and that kind of I guess deters you away from learning about it until another age. It doesn't even it's just hard to fathom at such a young age.
Hard to process even. I remember I was a little kid and I picked up the little boy on the wooden box. I believe it was called that, and wow, it's a very powerful book. You'll definitely feel. I know I felt very sad after reading it. It's in such detail.
And guys, kudos to you for holding the baton and supporting this effort to spread the word and make sure that younger generations, I assume that most of your viewers or listeners are younger. Um, I think it's really important. I think it's great, and continue doing that. That's so important.
Thank you, thank you.
Thank you.
So what are your future goals regarding Holocaust awareness? In other words, does it stop here after writing that memoir for your grandfather, or are you continuing to do something?
So this is all new to me.
Yeah.
This is a new path. The true answer is I don't know. I've been invited already to speak to certain audiences in North America, which I'm gladly planning to do. Um, Honestly, I'll get in front of anyone who wants to ask questions, to learn more, to engage, to talk about this, to spread the word further. This is so important. It's as important as anything else I'm doing. And given the opportunity, given the chance, I'll I'll continue telling the story. I'll write more, but I don't know. We'll see. We'll talk about it in a year or two.
Yeah. We'll circle back.
Definitely. And so when you were writing this book, and I know we may have touched on it previously, what was your intended impact on the readers?
Um, I'm not sure I spent a lot of time thinking about that. I think it was important for me to, first of all, convey the story truthfully, accurately, in a way, as I mentioned earlier, that is accessible to younger audiences and people of all ages. I think that while writing it, it became evident that it's important to me that people read this as a universal story, not necessarily as a Jewish story or Jewish alone. Obviously, the Holocaust is very specific to Jews, even though many other peoples suffered immensely during these periods of other nations, of other races. But it was important to me that it's read as a universal story about an individual struggle against sort of this evil of immense proportions. Obviously, he was Jewish, and obviously he experienced the genocide of the Jews in Europe in the 1940s. But it's really about an individual who's taking his destiny to his own hands, and against all odds, and with some good luck, making the right decisions, and pushing towards the right outcome for himself and for his family. And if people read this again as a universal story and not as specifically a Jewish story, then this book has served its purpose.
And I know we didn't review this question before, and we could edit it out if not. I just had this like while you were having that response. So you intended to keep it a nonfiction book, and a lot of the books I read, especially like when you after World War II or World War One, there was a lost generation of authors, and it refers to both authors dying in war as soldiers and both as them losing reality. And you can kind of see this. I actually have this next to me in Slaughterhouse 5, Kurt Vonnegut's Slaughterhouse 5.
Oh, one of my favorite books.
Great book.
Wow, talking about a gut-wrenching book.
Yeah. That's insane. And like books like his, like you could see that. There's also a book called Dunkirk that I read. And those books, like oftentimes they kind of disguise historical information with fictional stories because of the horrors and also just their way of processing and like being able to process it. Why was writing a nonfiction so important to you?
First of all, let me just say that being mentioned in the same podcast together with Vonnegut is probably one of my personal absolute peaks. So I appreciate that. That's you made my day. Thank you. Now, going specifically addressing your question, I mean, you read the book. This story is crazy, right? You don't need to go fictional. You don't need to invent anything. I mean, life was stranger than fiction in his story, in his path. It's difficult to believe that a sort of a series of unfortunate developments lead to sort of that reality and how a person survives that. I didn't feel that I needed to spice it up in any way with anything that was not completely authentic. I mean, the story itself shows you the ridiculously crazy nature of reality for a regular person in sort of devastated Europe of World War II in the 1940s. It was just that crazy.
I think you said it best. The truth
Yeah.
is sometimes stranger than fiction,
Yeah.
especially.
Yeah. Yeah, for sure. And this is a little spoiler ahead, so just skip to the next timestamp if you don't want to hear this. Do you think Alexander would have survived if had he not been raised in a bourgeoisie life? And that life allowed him to understand that perfect German that the soldiers were impressed by, and the mechanical skills that allowed him to work in that special factory where he had access to special privileges. Sweet privileges, literally. You'll get the reference if you read the book.
Yeah. Well, Stephen, you obviously read the book, so thank you. Um, it's a good question. I mean, I think that for his particular path and his particular circumstances, the answer is probably no. I think that sort of his life unintentionally prepared him in a way that's completely unpredictable to the unique set of events that allowed him to survive, to save his father, to come back home. But as I mentioned earlier in our discussion, I mean, many people survived. Most didn't, but many people survived, and the circumstances of their survival were so different. It was really about being in the right place at the right time, making the right small decision in that small moment that allowed them to keep on going. And many of the people that survived didn't have his background or didn't have his control of languages and didn't have his technical expertise, and they still managed to survive. But I think that what's common to many survival stories that I heard from survivors themselves, from in books that I read, is they were all extremely proactive, is that they all really wanted to live, is that they all understood that it was up to them because no one else is going to be there for them. No one else is going to save them. And it was up to them to save themselves, save their family, save other people around them. And many of the ones, and not everyone that was proactive and brave and had the initiative managed to escape and managed to survive. The odds were stacked against each and every one of them.
Those that did were.
But the ones that did, that was the common thread. That was the common theme. They wanted to survive. They knew that it was up to them, and they didn't rest until they made it out.
Mm-hmm.
It's the power of the human spirit, you know.
Yes.
And even like,
I mean, look at the leader of the Ukraine. Can you imagine? I mean, that will to save a nation, that will to
yeah,
save a people.
wow.
I mean, that charisma, that energy. Imagine where that nation would be without that, like that, without that leadership. How incredible is that?
Certainly in a much worse state than it is right now.
Yeah, yeah. Especially coming from like the meek political background he had come from to step up to this gigantic plate.
Yes.
So, over the course of writing this novel, was there what surprised you the most? Was there anything that really surprised you while you were writing?
I really enjoyed it. I never expected to enjoy sort of being closed in a room, reading and writing and rewriting and correcting and rewriting a paragraph. I mean, I'm used to a high pace, high intensity life, and it typically involves interaction with a lot of people, a lot of meetings, jumping from one place to the other. And I think that sitting down and writing a story, telling a story, requires a level of calmness that I never knew I had or was able to achieve. Maybe it comes with age. I don't know, but it definitely surprised me.
Yeah,
When I sat down for the first time, I sort of wasn't sure that this was something I'll be able to complete, and for sure something that I'll be able to truly enjoy and cherish. But at the end of it, it was a fantastic ride, and I must say that I'm looking forward to do it again. Hopefully, I don't need another global pandemic to get me to do it.
yeah, yeah, for sure. Um, So this is kind of a loaded question, as we had discussed before the meeting. Um, Given what you've learned from writing these stories, what would you tell people in general, not even Jews, who have experienced genocide or horror similar to that of the Holocaust?
Um, I wouldn't even know what a person that goes through such horror, and whether it's in Rwanda or in the death camps of Europe or in any other place where genocide happens feels. I mean, it's terrible. It's awful. I think that my message targets the others, the people who are experiencing, seeing, witnessing these. We are citizens of the world, and these are our brothers and sisters. It doesn't matter that we come from different races and different countries and different religions. It's our responsibility to shout, to speak up, to stand up against the oppressors and support those who are wronged. And it doesn't matter who they are. And I think that if the Holocaust taught us something, anything, is that we are responsible to identify these situations, and to make sure that we provide political, financial, and any other type of support, to make sure that these things never happen again. And again, it doesn't matter if it happens to people who are not Jews, not Americans, not people that we sort of relate to for being in similar groups or similar reference points to us. It could be very different people in different places in the world. We are responsible to make sure that they're not going through what we went through in Europe in the 1940s.
Yeah. Um, just like as a follow-up
That's a solid
question,
answer.
do you think like your book could apply, or just be like relatable to those who have experienced like other horrors similar to that of the Holocaust, or would it just strictly to apply to Jews?
I mean, I hope if it gives courage to a single person, doesn't matter what their age, gender, religion, race, or nationality is, to speak up, to stand up, to take responsibility and ownership of their destiny against evil forces, oppressors, or people that harm them. Then this book was worthwhile. It's definitely not aimed only at Jews or only at people that survived the Holocaust. The whole intention of it is to be sort of universal and spread a message of initiative, of taking ownership and responsibility of your life, of fighting, and being optimists about your chances of prevailing.
Yeah, I think that's like very true.
Yeah.
Yeah.
So, sorry. So, on to our next question. If your grandfather could read the book, what feedback do you think he would provide? Positive, negative, and why do you think he'd give that feedback?
Um, I mean, I hope he likes the book, wherever he is, if he reads it. I mean, he would love it because he loved everything and anything I did, if it was good, bad, or mediocre. That was the type of person he was. So I would never be able to trust him to give an unbiased review of the book. So there would be zero value to his feedback in that sense. But I think that he'll be happy that his story is told. I mean, some of my strongest memories, childhood memories, growing up in Netanya in Israel, was every Holocaust Remembrance Day, he would come to class and he would tell his stories. And I would just look around the room and look at the teacher and the principal and the other kids, and they were all like eyes wide open, like asking him questions, being in awe of his bravery and everything that he did. He loved telling the story. I mean, there are many, many Holocaust survivors that did not want to talk about sort of those years, the loss of their loved ones, their own traumas. He was completely the opposite. He was able to completely block that period emotionally and to just talk about almost the mechanical aspects of surviving, of really being smart, really outsmarting the enemy, taking the right set of actions, making the right decisions to make sure that he prevails. And he loved telling those stories. So from that angle, he would have been thrilled that this book is being published.
Yeah, I was about to say, heck, even if he wasn't, even if he didn't like some of the things that, I, sorry, came out wrong. I think he would have been super proud of you just bringing that story to a wider audience to make sure that people are educated on this part of history that's very often very hard for people to talk about, even people that have gone through it.
Yeah, like also, I think like given that your grandfather likes to tell it, I think that maybe, I mean, I don't want to assume, but I think that plays in part to his very, very, very logical view of the horrors. Like usually, as what I've read, or what I would feel as if I were in that situation, more like overwhelmed by the horror and kind of just looking at this. But he very like objectively notices certain things and knows how to capitalize on them. Like for example, like with that the scene during the Orthodox rabbis, when they first get to the camp, it's freezing outside. The father asks them to go inside the tent for body warmth, and the Orthodox rabbis, kind of in a trance, say no. And then they're deceased. It's not like he's surprised, like he kind of saw it coming, and like because of that, like his ability to just foresee events very logically, he's able to manipulate situations and also not let emotions overwhelm him. Like his father's in the infirmary group 12, 13, 26.
Block 29, yeah.
29, block 29. There's no block 29 there. He realizes the infirmary, and instead of maybe like freaking out or just kind of like giving up, he goes straight ahead, right into business mode, calmly negotiates with the chocolates, allows him to transfer notes to his father.
Spoiler alert.
Yeah, I guess I'll put it away. And then just like all that, and then like his father comes like emaciated, and then instead of like kind of freaking out or something, or his father saying like, I don't think I have much time left, he like disregards that and just makes him like eat essentially, and then methodically, that's wrong. Methodically, goes on like 5-minute walk, 10-minute walk, incremental walks, because he knows he's going to get better. He's very good at understanding progression rather than allowing emotion to overwhelm him. I guess that plays into the optimism, and I think that's why he's able to freely talk about it, because it seems like he just views like life in a very different way.
Yeah, that's a great observation, and it goes back to the ability to disconnect emotionally. I mean, you can only be a true optimist going through those adventures if you're able to disconnect and basically delete and be a master of controlling your emotions as you think about your next move. You can't let your emotions take the better of you.
Yeah. It's like a Stoic philosophy, almost.
Yeah, for sure. And like it's not like just like a hopeless optimist, like, oh, like maybe he'll get better. Like he creates his optimism essentially, and that's
he
why
creates his reality. Absolutely.
You create your own luck.
Yeah. Sorry. And for question 13, if this had not been your grandfather's last wish to write the book, would you still have written it?
Absolutely. I mean, this is a story that I had to tell. I don't know if it was this format or another format, or 10 years ago or 10 years from now, but growing up, I knew that I have this duty, I have this responsibility to tell the story. My grandfather was a lot of things. He was not a writer, and he was too old to basically engage with the world in telling the story. And I also think that there's a lot of, it's logical that the third generation is spending more time reliving those stories and telling those stories than in many ways the second generation, where telling these stories and engaging with their parents had a it was much more loaded. I think that it's in many ways easier for the third generation to do that, and it is definitely our responsibility to take the time, dig deep inside our souls, our experiences, our time spent with our grandparents, and tell their stories to the world.
Yeah, I think that's like I think it's really cool. I guess like when I just saw like the acknowledgments like to fulfill the grandfathers on Swiss, I was just like wondering if that had like been the reason you started now, or if like that was the end result either way.
Yeah.
No, actually, it wasn't. I mean, going back 40 years, and we were talking about it when I was recording him, when we were in Slovakia on the ground, when we were in Eastern Germany in Weimar, going into Buchenwald. We would always joke about it, and I would say, "Yeah, one day, Grandpa, I'm going to write this book." And he was laughing, say, "Come on, who's going to want to read this? I mean, there's so many stories. I mean, people don't care about this." And I told him, "Look, this is a sick story. It's incredible. We have to tell this. People would want to know about you. They would want to know about. I mean, your the road you've taken." And he would look at me and say, "Really? You think so?" I said, "Yeah, I think so." So it became something that we talked about, and he would. Um, I mean, there was that dichotomy between him telling his story in a like very persuasive way in front of audiences in my school and the community and etc. But then when we were sitting together and I would say, "This needs to be like an HBO series or a book," and he would say, "No, no one would find interest in this," and I would say, "You're dead wrong. You'll see."
And you proved them wrong.
Unfortunately, he didn't get the experience it when he was still alive, but in many ways, it could never have happened the way that it's happening now when he was alive. So things need to happen at their own pace.
Yeah, yeah. Um, yeah, it's a good response. Like,
Yeah.
um,
And I mean,
now,
heck, even,
yeah. Sorry, you go.
just, who would want to read this? Well, I mean, we certainly did. And I'm sure once we get the link out there and once it's finally published, I'm sure many other people would love to experience the story firsthand.